welcome to Relevant History. I'm Dan Toller. As promised, I am bringing you today a bonus episode to fill a little bit of the gap between seasons 1 and 2. So if you're just here for the narrative history, I won't be offended if you skip this one. That said, I hope you do stick around because my guest today is a personal friend as well as someone I think you would be interested in hearing from if you're already interested in my show. Meet Jordyn, a fellow quirky podcaster.
Hello.
I'm here today to talk with Jordyn primarily about the history of anarchism, as promised, but Jordyn also knows a fair bit about Daoism and, most importantly, dead malls. So,
yeah, dead malls are pretty much what my podcast is going to be about. Hopefully I can get out by the end of the month, because needless to say, I've been either procrastinating or becoming very unfocused.
It is a real struggle.
Indeed.
Yeah, so I guess let's start with the most basic question, or I guess I'll lead in first. The reason I wanted to talk about anarchism and that it's interesting to me, particularly in the context of my show, is season 2 of my show is basically going to be the story of the first half of the 20th century, give or take, viewed through the lens of nationalism versus globalism. And anarchism is interesting to me because it is neither nationalist nor globalist. It almost seems to be like a very old school local type deal. Is that a fair description?
Yes and no, because how do I put it with anarchism? Anarchism is like, I guess if you could describe the political compass, it is very much everything as long as it's not authoritarian. You can be local, internationalist. And needless to say, there are too many thoughts of mine. Some of them I find a little bit bullshit, but if you're okay with swearing on that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's just one of those things where it's just either A, internationalist, B, globalist, sometimes nationalist. Even then, it's hard to describe even with that, because if anything, you want to get rid of that under anarchism. But there are some people who, for some reason, subscribe to that thought, which, to be honest, that's kind of like more of a going into it.
Okay, well, that makes sense. I mean, nationalism kind of requires the existence of a state, and presumably if you're into anarchism, you're opposed to the existence of the state.
Pretty much.
So this is actually a great place to start, because the other thing that interests me about the conversation I'm going to be having this season with globalism versus nationalism is that it often gets pegged as a left-right debate, with people kind of pegging globalism as a left-wing ideology and nationalism as right-wing. I think that's an artifact of the early 20th century. I mean, Hitler and Mussolini, pretty right-wing, pretty nationalist. Early communists, obviously, very internationalist. But if you go back to the beginnings of nationalism, from the French Revolution through the revolutions of the late 1800s, nationalism was very left-wing coded. And internationalism, the idea was almost often couched in the idea of the altar and the crown, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example, which is kind of a right-wing idea, and it almost became inverted in the 20th century. Anyway, I'm rambling. What is anarchism, Jordyn?
Well, anarchism at its most basic elements is you're pretty much like anti-state, anti-hierarchy. You're pretty much working down from the individual up. You're going bottom up. That's the quintessential bare essentials of it. You want to go from at least some form of bottom to top organization, where you're focusing on what is the individual needs. to what you can do to everyone else around you with a premise of either mutual aid, community organizing, or, like some sort of bare bones organization where you're trying not to be top-down hierarchical.
Okay. So obviously, fast forwarding from the beginnings of anarchism to the early 20th century, it's pretty easy to see the arguments that for example, the Russian anarchists were having with the Bolsheviks, the Bolsheviks being very top down.
Yeah.
But to start at the beginning, can you tell me a little bit about Mikhail Bakunin and his split with Karl Marx?
Oh, Mikhail Bakunin. That guy. Well, if we're going to start with Mikhail Bakunin, we're going to have to go even a little bit further back to at least Proudhon. Because Proudhon was more coalesced the start of getting anarchism to its more official starts with what is property. And I'm trying so hard to remember what is property because it has been such a long time, but I remember Bakunin a little bit more. But Proudhon was the guy who more got the gravy train starting that led to Bakunin. Because Bakunin definitely did know Proudhon and did at least have some sort of communications with him. And with Bakunin went a little bit further and was more like the ironing out the edges kind of guy to me, from what I remember. Because he did have a good amount of ideas that did agree with Marx. But Marx was definitely working, to me, a little bit more on a different angle where he was definitely an economist. Man definitely had ideas. But I still think that their main split, to me, seems to be how to get to their angle.
Yeah, I have not read much by Bakunin. The only thing that specifically I do remember is his prediction that if Marx launched a communist, or Marxists, I should say, if Marx's followers launched a communist revolution in Russia, that within a generation they'd just get co-opted by the bureaucracy and you'd have a red czar, which is, kind of what happened.
Yeah, Bakunin was right on that end. Yeah, because, Bakunin and Marx certainly did have a fair bit of, overlap with each other, because I know one of the main things I usually bring up with overlap is that they did agree upon at least the idea of the proletariat being exploited by the capitalist class. But I still think that one of the main things that I see as a huge rift that I can always pick up right away pretty quick that I always remember is there was this one quote he had where he definitely wants to bring down the idea of the petty bourgeois, your artisans, have more in common with the proletariat, and they should be included in the revolution because they have just as much to lose with industrialization because the watchmaker could lose out to the watch factory, that kind of thing.
I was reading towards the end of my last season, actually talked about it a little bit. That was a big driver of Italian immigration. My ancestors coming to the U.S. was rapid industrialization in Italy. Just absolutely demolished the artisan class.
Yeah, and I know Bakunin worked very hugely with the Italian anarchist group because I think he was also a reason why a lot of those guys came over and made a lot of newspapers here in the U.S. I wouldn't be surprised if he was involved.
No, nor would I. So skipping ahead a little bit, you have Bakunin's split with Marx. You have the First International, which ultimately falls apart in squabbling between the communists and the anarchists. Then the communists form the Second International. What are anarchist thinkers doing around that time in the late 1800s?
The late 1800s. Well, for the most part, in the late 1800s, you still have, the Italians and at least some semblance of organizing going on with the trade unions. Because I know eventually you start getting to the lines of syndicalism over time, which syndicalism seems to be, at least in the European sense from what I know, it seems to be building up a bit more, especially in Spain, Germany, France, Europe, that whole general area, Western Europe, where you have syndicalism building up. And the communists, at least from my knowledge, at least in the Lenin camp, were just kind of sitting in exile somewhere, whether it be Switzerland or whatnot. Because I wish I could remember my European development of socialism more than I do my Asian development, because Asian socialism is a lot wilder compared to the Europeans, because to me, the Europeans, it's a lot of a straight line to me.
Oh, don't worry. We'll get to China.
Yeah, China's like my main bread and butter, but I know at least with Europe, my main knowledge usually defaults to what is going on in the Rudolf Rocker camp or what is happening in the Russian Revolution. Because for the most part, it seems that their history seems to slow down after the Second International. Because it seems to be like a lot of quiet organizing from what I've been seeing. Or at least moving over to the U.S., because the U.S. does have its explosion with the Haymarket Affair in the 1880s, 1890s.
McKinley being assassinated by an anarchist.
Yeah, McKinley being assassinated, Emma Goldman becoming radicalized, Alexander Berkman becoming radicalized. Because it seems a lot of the anarchist development, at least in the 1880s to 1890s, seems to happen a lot in the U.S. for some reason.
Well, it would make sense. You had a lot of people during the European revolutions of the late 1840s and then into the 60s and 70s. A lot of them, when they would lose, would move to the U.S. You had a huge number of German leftists who were expelled and ended up commanding as a disproportionate number of generals in the Union Army during the Civil War.
Oh, and not to mention a lot of the Russian anarchists and leftists being booted out in the 1880s, with the exception of Tolstoy.
So what happened there? Was there a purge of anarchists in Russia in the 1880s?
Well, the 1880s was around the time also when, well, how do I put it? Russia was getting this huge wave of enforced reform, because you had the liberation of the serfs, the freedom of the serfs, and eventually the attempted assassination of Alexander the Second, if I remember right.
Okay, that would be before the successful assassination, right?
Yeah, because if I remember right, there was the attempted assassination on Alexander II that led to a huge amount of crackdowns and a lot of Russian leftists being attempted to leave. And I remember that was also around the same time. Actually, no. Emma Goldman, I think, immigrated when she was a child to the United States. Because I know a lot of Russian newspapers, if I can remember right, they also ended up in North America slowly from the 1880s up to the 1890s. And at least up until about maybe World War I, especially after McKinley, because a lot of the Russian anarchists started getting expelled under Wilson.
Really?
Yeah, because you had the first Red Scare. Because the first Red Scare started under Wilson as the First World War was going on, and especially when the Bolshevik Revolution kicked off. Because I know after 1905, things in Russia started to slowly backslide, and some of the anarchists there and some of the leftists there started to at least begin reappearing in Russia. I mean, I know Emma Goldman, I think, was trying to remember when. Yeah, I think she went in towards the end of World War I because she was expelled by Wilson along with Berkman to side eventually the Bolsheviks, and later witnessed what happened at Kronstadt, to eventually saying, this Bolshevik revolution is betraying the workers and the proletariat and everything that it stands for. And then she gets booted to China.
Okay, so is she one of the thought leaders in bringing anarchism to China, or does China at this point already have its own anarchist tradition?
China was starting to get their anarchist tradition towards the late Qing. So we're thinking like towards 1904 with a definitive start, with some little blurbs and hiccups beforehand in the Qing court.
honestly, if you're looking at a ripe ground for anarchism, I'm honestly surprised that the anarchists were not more successful in China than the nationalists early on, because you had a collapsing empire, you had a bureaucratic state that most people agreed was corrupt.
Yeah, Chinese anarchists, I'd still say, were arguably the most successful, aside from Rudolf Rocker and the Barcelona Commune, whatever you want to call it. When the anarcho-syndicalists went in and took over Barcelona and a bunch of other parts of Spain.
Now, who is Rudolf Rocker, or who was he?
Well, Rudolf Rocker was probably one of the most foremost, prominent theorists when it came to anarcho-syndicalism. Because anarcho-syndicalism is basically trade unions. Trade unions. Like, I cannot emphasize how much they want their trade unions.
Okay, so that would obviously not jive with the Bolshevik ideas.
Yeah, because with anarcho-syndicalism, Rudolf Rocker's main theory was you can organize things based on labor unions, as long as you don't have that top-down hierarchy, of course. You still got to work with your people. You still have your syndicates, and they have to be, like in tandem working with each other. Because they have an idea of what they want and how to move things forward and how to make sure things keep running.
I think there's a Spanish company still today. Is it Mondragon? That's still fairly large, fairly profitable workers cooperative.
I wish I could say yes, but I fell off of my Spanish anarchism knowledge after the Soviets clamped down on them, and then eventually Franco won.
Yeah, that's an interesting period to me, because it's obvious to me in the Russian Civil War why the Bolsheviks would want to purge the anarchists. It's not so obvious to me why Stalin goes in the way he does in Spain, because the anarchists in Spain, the anarchists are winning, arguably, at least holding their own against the nationalists. The Italians and the Germans come in to help the nationalists. The Soviets come in to help the Republicans. And the first thing Stalin does almost is purge all the anarchists, basically dooming his side in the Civil War at the start. You'd think he'd want to win first, but he almost seems more worried about the anarchists than he does about the fascists.
Yeah, Stalin was a very paranoid boy, to say the least.
Yeah, well, maybe that's it. Maybe he's more worried about opposition inside the house than opposition outside the house.
I mean, he very well knew how to coup, at least from within his own. Granted, it really only worked once. How do I put it? Stalin was put into the key position when he was within Lenin's government of general secretary of, yes. He was the guy in charge of hiring.
I see what you mean.
Yeah, I feel like he only successfully couped once. And then never again.
He would have had to coup himself.
Exactly. And even then, I think Khrushchev learned from the best. Then again, he didn't learn from his own mistakes.
No, he was shown the door eventually, wasn't he?
By Brezhnev. Learn about that more when The Death of Stalin, the comedy movie. It's fairly historically accurate.
And hilarious.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on to your wheelhouse.
Yes.
China. We have some anarchist activity in Russia during the Civil War. I'll be talking about that in Season 2. We have some anarchist activity, successful anarchist activity in Spain in the Civil War until Stalin takes their knees out from under them. What goes on in China during their civil war?
Well, China, like anything with the Chinese Civil War, you kind of have to break it off into its own timeline because the Chinese Civil War is the most convoluted, but yet somehow easiest and stupidest civil war you can imaginably think of. But if you can have a definitive start, we have to go to the end of the first Sino-Japanese War in 1895. Because to summarize that war, China loses its last sphere of influence in Korea to Japan, and China has a break. Like, how do I put it? The Qing dynasty was rocked to the core, and you have a government that's a mix of trying to stabilize between people who don't want to change the system under Empress Dowager Cixi. And she's basically the person in charge. It isn't the emperor anymore. It's the Empress Dowager at the time.
Empress Dowager, I don't know much about Chinese history. Is she the emperor's mom? Is she like some other relative?
She's usually either the wife of the emperor or like the top women official in government, because China only ever had one woman emperor and they collectively decided never again. So the only way if you were a woman to be getting power in the Chinese imperial system is to basically be Empress Dowager or one of the concubines. And Empress Dowager is basically the top woman official in the entire government. And she could hypothetically rule through the emperor if she wanted to.
Okay, well, that would not be unique at all historically.
Yeah.
So you have obviously a crumbling regime there in China. Tries to presumably win this war in Korea and maintain some prestige. Fails. What happens then? Is there a split in the military and the bureaucracy?
Well, it just seemed like there was a huge shakeup because by 1898 there was the Emperor Guangzi, who was ascending to the throne, who managed to break out of his regency the first time, because the Empress Dowager can also function as a regent when the emperor isn't old enough. And the Emperor Guangzi realizes that there has to be some level of change. And needless to say, this is also around the same time when the Boxer Uprising happened. And I'm using the word uprising because it wasn't really rebellion against the Qing. It was just an overall thing that just happened against the Western powers trying to move in, especially after China basically looking weak, losing in Korea.
Now, the Boxers, correct me if I'm wrong, the Society of the Harmonious Fist?
Yes.
And there's some Christian splinter group that thinks that they can't be harmed by weapons, so they try to fight people hand to hand. You can tell I know a ton about Chinese history, right?
Yeah, I mean, the Boxers themselves, they're more of a secret society that blew out. But 1898 was the year they rose up, and it was also the year when the Qing court tried to attempt some level of reform, especially starting with education. And Guangzhou at least had some capable ministers, Li Chizhou or Chuzhou. I'm trying to remember how to pronounce his name. I'm trying my best, people. I'm sorry if my pronunciation is bad. I only took one class in Chinese history, and they made me crash course pronunciation hard, and I'm trying to learn since then.
If it's any comfort, they've had to spend the last few years listening to me mispronounce all kinds of stuff. So
yeah, I'm trying my best. But you had Li Chizhou or Chizhou, trying to remember which, but I do remember Kang Yuwei. These two guys were basically guys who were trying to overhaul the education system to a point where they were starting to introduce Western influence. And these guys had some degree of exposure to utopian thought, as they did allow the education circle, at least allowing some beginning to at least some degree of change, both within China and allowing students to go abroad to learn how to modernize China. Because these three people, the emperor and these two guys, were trying to get people out to start getting an education, primarily in Japan and France.
Now, what was the issue with the Chinese education system? Was it just horribly outdated?
It was like horrendously outdated because the Chinese education system was still largely relying upon Confucian tradition. Because you're still having people read the imperial exams before the war, at least if I'm remembering that right. Because you still have people who are still being trained like Confucian scholars going into the government. So you have this horrendously antiquated system, a mix of Chinese superiority where it's like China's still like the Middle Kingdom. I mean, this is like a very bad oversimplification, but you're going from a country that has been refusing to reform and has very rarely taken any ideas from the West other than maybe just trying to reform some of their armaments industry. And now you're going to, oh crap, we can't beat anyone in a war. We need to start at least having an idea of modernizing. And that leads to a split in the Qing court. Because you have, and then you basically have Sizi, who's still somewhat in power. She's not as much in power anymore because the Emperor Guangzhou is still in power. So in order to curb this, she launches a coup. Or at least a soft coup to force him back into regency under pretenses of illness.
Okay, so she's going to retake power and try and roll back some of these reforms?
But not completely, because the moment you start educating someone beyond like when you start to lose control, when you want to try and bring back control, you at least have to throw a bone. And she did at least throw a bone by overthrowing the imperial exams, but she still allows people to get educated abroad.
Okay.
So this education abroad leads to basically other people starting to learn more things, and it starts to break off into different factions at that point, starting especially in 1904.
So is that education abroad then? Is that where you start to see the infusion of anarchists and communists and presumably other Western political ideas?
For the most part, yes. Because then again, you're still branching off into different factions depending on where you are, because in 1904 you had the Paris anarchists who started learning from French anarchists, and they eventually kickstarted what would eventually be known in communist lore as the Diligent Work Study Program, which the Diligent Work Study Program didn't produce just communists, it produced like other forms of leftists too. Because, but you still had largely a base of, like being introduced to left-leaning thought in general from the anarchists, from the first Paris anarchists, who eventually started bringing more people over to work and study in their camp, while also basically running a factory too, because they ran a tofu factory.
So just to clarify, the Paris anarchists are, or the Paris, the work study program, these people are Chinese students abroad living in Paris.
Yes.
That is really cool.
Yeah. Because one of the ways that, you were able to get more of an education abroad if you were Chinese, if you wanted to get an education abroad, one of the ways you could possibly subsidize these costs was by going with this group.
Okay.
Or if you wanted to go the cheaper option, but also seek this sort of leftist thought, you went to Tokyo.
Really?
Yeah. Because Tokyo, and well, especially Japan, their anarchist thought was largely stemming from initially the Russian emigres that were being slowly kicked out, and some of them were anarchists themselves. But they had a very interesting quirk about them because the Paris and Tokyo anarchist groups had separate quirks. Because the Paris anarchists, I could say, were a little bit more modern in their thinking. They wanted to more move towards some type of industrialization to catch up to a degree, and at least adopted more European-style anarchism and leftist thought, compared to the Tokyo group, where they kind of like adopted it in elements of to a certain degree, but they still wanted to keep it more agrarian. I'm basing this off of what I was able to read from Liu Shipei, the traitor.
See, that is fascinating to me, because when I think of, like, when you tell me there's a bunch of anarchists running a tofu factory and a work-study program in Paris, that totally makes sense. When you tell me there's an anarchist group active in Tokyo in the late 19th, early 20th century, that's fascinating, because I think of Japan in that period as being so hyper-nationalist. I mean, you have the Son of Joy movement, revere the emperor, expel the foreigner. But you also have this anarchist group in Tokyo.
Yeah, they were a weird bunch because, I mean, the Tokyo anarchists were pretty much the most self-destructive group, because I know one of the few things that I think with Japan could agree upon, at least in their government, is a lot of these anarchists have to go. And they saw a lot of their convenient excuse to getting rid of them, especially their main leader and organizer, Asugi Sake. They killed him in the Tokyo earthquake. He survived, only to be assassinated in the aftermath.
Now, did they try and cover it up and make it look like he was killed in the earthquake, or did they just kind of take advantage of the fact that he was available, so to speak?
I think they did take advantage of the fact that the earthquake happened, and they're like, well, he survived, a lot of people died, and they just basically managed to find their golden excuse to just kill him. And I know, at least with the 20s, especially after the Bolshevik Revolution and the first Red Scare, you started having all these people taking advantage, trying to get rid of these people. And I know, especially in Japan, starting after 1908, they really started, like, softly trying to push the Tokyo anarchists out.
Now, do you see a similar pattern as you do with Western anarchists, with Tokyo anarchists fleeing the country to China or to somewhere else?
They do. A lot of them do move back to China, especially Liu Shipei, because Liu Shipei went the wildest turncoat betrayal possible. Because this is a little bit fast forward, but strictly speaking, from about 1904 to 1908, Liu Shipei was definitely, along with his wife He Jian, were definitely anarchists, and they were one of the first people to translate the Communist Manifesto. So the Chinese Communist Party came at least 12 years after the fact, when the Communist Manifesto was translated into Chinese. So the anarchists did it first. That's
actually very much in keeping with the anarchist tradition. I was reading about the anarchists in Barcelona setting up their educational system, and one of their leaders, I forget who, said something along the lines of, well, we'll know our education system is really successful if we're having students that are not all perfect good anarchists, and a bunch of them have their own ideas.
Yeah. It's just very interesting, because I again, speaking about the Tokyo anarchists, these guys were probably the most interesting of the bunch, because they still largely thought that they could keep things agrarian. They didn't want to industrialize as hard. They wanted to industrialize to the point of saying, let's just make life simple. And don't be a dick, essentially.
So they're less about industrial trade unions and more about the agrarian life?
Yeah, more the agrarian life. And I'm basing this off of what I could read from Liu Shipei's newspaper. Because he did write a newspaper until it was banned in Tokyo, and he eventually went back to China. Because compared to the Paris anarchists, they eventually did go back to China, but they largely sided with Sun Yat-sen and the Dongmenhui.
Now, Sun Yat-sen, that's a name I recognize. He is he the, like, I always hesitate to use the words like leader when referring to an anarchist movement. It seems self-defeating, but for lack of a better term, is he a major anarchist leader in China?
To be honest, no. Even though he could have said at times that anarchism was a goal, I don't think the man was genuinely an anarchist. I think he was just kind of more, at least to me, some type of socialist. like non-denominational socialist.
Okay, just a general left type fellow.
Yeah, because he did try to work as practically as he could. And a lot of the anarchists, at least in the Paris group, did side with him and eventually became the old guard of the Kuomintang. But that was just one side of the faction, because a lot of the early Paris anarchists eventually did become early founding members of the Kuomintang with Sun Yat-sen, and eventually did play part in their own purge. But they did play, each of these groups eventually did coalesce in China to at least try and do something. And to a degree, I think in the end, they did kind of meet their end goals, but in the end, they did meet probably the most violent end of any anarchist group, movement in the entirety of, like anarchist history.
So this is fascinating because I don't know a lot about this. When I think when most Westerners think of the Kuomintang, they think of the Chinese nationalists. They think of Chiang Kai-shek.
Yeah.
How does that guy end up in charge of a movement that started out basically as being led by anarchists? Does he?
Well, he largely comes more into effect after the Kuomintang, after the basically second attempt at the Kuomintang, which was after the Warring States period started, when Yuan Shikai basically curbed the provisional government and declared himself emperor. Because Chiang Kai-shek, or Jiang Jiexi as I usually refer to him as, he largely comes into effect as the military guy, because he did get some Soviet training, so he did get some type of political theory, but Jiang Jiexi, he just functions largely as just another warlord, in my opinion, more than a political figure. I mean, people can try and say that, yeah, he did have politics to his name, but the thing is, he was overall just a military guy who understood a decent amount of the political game, and at least enough to do something, but he was just a horrendous micromanager.
That tracks. Sounds like a lot of military dictators, for lack of a better term, or wannabe military dictators.
Yeah, he peaks at his terribleness towards his entire career when he was in charge, and the times when he sort of wasn't, but still nominally was.
It's funny. I've similar thoughts about Mao, because, like, as a general, especially as a leader of a guerrilla army, Mao is like S tier historically.
Yeah, Mao's always been a good leader in terms of military wise. It's just that when he's a practical all-around leader, sometimes curb your enthusiasm is a very strong thing you need to have.
Yeah. If you're gonna do major agricultural changes, it's probably wise to experiment first instead of just enacting them on the whole country.
Yeah, and even then, he had a lot of his theory. It sounds very similar to what a lot of anarcho-communists in early modern China, like after the Qing were overthrown, a lot of his thought would fall in line pretty good with early anarchism before the First World War.
Well, I'm thinking of, the backyard furnaces idea he had, with every household making its own little supply of iron. Yeah. That's not something the Soviets would ever dream of doing. Yeah, it's not bureaucratic enough.
And infusing education with actual work. Like, the anarchists tried that beforehand, during, and even during when Jiang Jiexi was in charge of the whole mainland, arguably, with air quotes quotations, in control of the mainland. He never was.
I think the Japanese might have something to say about that.
Not even the Japanese held the entire mainland. They couldn't even hold on to shit.
Oh no, they barely held the coast. But I mean, the fact that they held a good portion of it basically eliminates his title, and then obviously Mao controls some of it at all times.
Yeah, because the only person after the fall of the Qing who even held on to the entirety of the mainland it wasn't Jiang Jiexi. You could argue that, yeah, he was in charge, but at the same time, he still had to wrestle with the northern warlords, the southern warlords, and then Chiang Kai in the west, basically acting as a rebel the entire time he was in charge of Xinjiang.
So no, well, that does make sense to me too, because China is it has its Han core homeland, and then historically China kind of shrinks and expands from there as the Han gain and lose influence.
Yeah, because the main thing about China isn't entirely a united country, even throughout its history, and even the anarchists, to a degree, had to basically contend with this fact.
Well, Xinjiang, the local population there, and I'm completely blanking on the ethnic group there, which I should know
they had a bunch, but I know the Uyghurs were one. But
yes,
they also had Turkmen.
The Uyghurs but the Uyghurs are also Turkic.
Yeah,
those were all people who came over during the Islamic expansion. They've been there forever.
And then the Soviets tried. Yeah. But that's besides the point. I know that China, not whole, anarchists couldn't contend. Even the communists, to a degree, couldn't contend with that for the most part, but in the end, they still won.
Now, is a lot of that just through inertia? I mean, you have like a 50-year period of civil war. I assume there's some element of normie Chinese people being like, I'm sick of the fighting. I will accept any government at this point.
I mean, on one end, yes. Because a lot of what Maoism eventually adopted did have its roots in anarchism. Because it seems that the most definitive lineage that eventually became Maoism started with a kind of an amalgam of both Paris and anarchist in the form of one man, Liu Shifu.
Who is Liu Shifu?
He was a fierce Kropotkin copier. And this man, he initially got educated from a mix of both. If I remember, he did go to Tokyo. I think he did go to Tokyo, but he also did get education from the Paris group, because when he came back from Tokyo and went back to China completely an anarchist, he started doing what a lot of anarchists did before they decided to calm down, which is a lot of assassination, a lot of attempted assassination against the Qing, one of which costed this man his arm. And if I can recall the quote right, he got himself blown up, blew his arm off, and then when he was coming back to his wits, because he did survive, he's just like, please mind the explosives, they're armed. After he got his arm pretty much blown off. Yeah, needless to say, that pretty much took him out of assassination activities for the rest of his life. Because he primarily based himself out of Guangzhou, which was formerly known as Canton at the time. Like, that used to be his main area of operations. And a lot of his thought was based on Kropotkin, and eventually you start seeing some of these ideas coalesce into something more, combination of education and working with the populace, establishing trade unions. Some of these ideas also translate into the Kuomintang itself too, but this guy was like trying his hardest to organize labor unions after he got himself blown up and after the provisional government nominally takes charge in the wake of the Qing abdicating.
Now, the time frame here. Yeah. The provisional government is in charge
from about 1911 to about 1916, when Yuan Shikai says, I am now emperor.
Okay. Now, does that immediately trigger, I don't even want to say trigger the Chinese Civil War, because it seems like they're kind of low-key in one already at that point. But
their civil war largely started when Sun Yat-sen and a bunch of other rebels, especially after the Wuchang uprising, managed to gain steam and start pushing towards Peking, now known as Beijing. And in order for them to at least have a chance of winning, or at least getting the Qing dynasty to abdicate and give up, they had to convince Yuan Shikai, which I probably should have mentioned earlier as the man who lost in Korea in Sino-Japanese War I. Oof. Yeah. Yuan Shikai has a very long career, but this was his golden shining moment. He manages to convince the then, at the time, 6-year-old Emperor Puyi to abdicate. And on the condition of he gets to be president.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah. And then when he is president, he starts making moves to at least somewhat consolidate and at least try and keep things running and not collapsing. But Yuan Shikai, he declares himself emperor. Immediately, everyone hates it because it's just like, we just spent God knows how many years trying to get rid of the Qing dynasty, and you just go and turn on us and become emperor.
It seems like like the Chinese version of Stalin, almost. Like, wait a minute, we just got rid of the Tsar. What?
Yeah, sort of. Except in this case, this guy didn't really care about democracy in the slightest. And needless to say, a lot of people who he had on his side, which included like a wide spread of people, of which, like warlords who were already starting to build themselves up in the wake of the First War being destroyed, and even back further to even the Taiping Rebellion, because you have to go back even further with these guys, where you start seeing warlords starting to crop up after the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was overthrown. And you're starting to build up this huge level of a fragile feudalistic system where you're having to rely on these guys to be reliable to pay you taxes. And if these guys went along with the gravy train of getting rid of the Qing dynasty, and now you have a new emperor that's trying to demand your loyalty, and you don't see eye to eye politically every time, you have some people who are still mad that the emperor's deposed at the time.
This as a fan of Roman history, this is all starting to become very familiar.
Yeah, it just becomes the ugliest, messiest civil war that I wish I could oversimplify, but it's near impossible because you have so many warlords, and the only way to simplify it is to them going into cliques. Because you have, and it's also defined by region too at times, because you have your Jili, your Ma, your Anli. It's just so many cliques that's not even funny. And even Sun Yat-sen basically forms his own clique when he's basically creating what we know as the Kuomintang today. And these early Paris anarchists attach themselves to this too.
To Sun Yat-sen's group?
Yeah. Because the Paris group, a lot of the early party elders were basically the people who founded the Paris anarchists, who eventually sided with them.
Oh, and that's how they become part of the old guard.
Pretty much. And then you have Liu Shifu, who's just eventually doing his own thing, and he's just getting mad at everyone, because it's like, what the fuck? You have Liu Shipei, who basically decided to pull the gamer move of siding with Yuan Shikai when he declared himself emperor, which is like, you go from anarchist to monarchist, which does make sense with him because he didn't like industrialization to the degree that the Paris group wanted, and he would rather be with a monarchist than Sun Yat-sen because he viewed that as straying away from anarchism somehow. But it makes sense in the view of, I don't like modernizing. These guys are closer to anarchism more than the Paris group, so I'm siding with them.
Okay. It's kind of a case of pick your poison, then. If you're a politically involved person in China, you're basically choosing which warlord to sign up with?
Pretty much. And Liu Shifu just said, fuck all of you. I'm going on my own, and I'm going to call out people as I see fit. And then he straight up dies in 1915. So the call-outs didn't last very long. We had about maybe 4 years worth, because 1911 to 1915 were his most active years, even as he was dying. Because this man died young because, to bring it back up earlier, man blew his arm off, and it basically led to him becoming immunocompromised.
Oh, no.
Yeah. The man was very stubborn. He stuck to, if the man basically held a viewpoint, he was going to stick to it no matter what, even if he was dying. And that's basically what got to him, because I know it, when he was dying and struggling, even after he was forced to flee Guangzhou in 1913 to Shanghai, which eventually later became the next strongest hub for anarchism if you didn't want to be with the Paris group, which then started to side with the Kuomintang, or the Tokyo anarchists, which were basically self-imploding at this point.
I feel like I need a flow chart for this revolution.
Exactly. This is why I devoted more of my time to Chinese anarchism, because on one end, you got groups backstabbing each other, some groups stabbing each other from within, and then some that just self-destruct. But they were able to get each other to at least working enough in tandem, or at least enough power when World War I broke out, because after Liu Shifu died, his group just spread. And they just kept spreading to the point where eventually you have some other anarchists groups starting to pop up, especially in Beijing, which were already doing that beforehand towards 1912. Because if I remember, that's how one guy eventually started getting socialism officially introduced in China. He just went to China, gave a lecture on socialism, and then just kind of became a marked man in 1912.
Oof.
Yeah.
So this is an environment where you can give a speech and now you've got a target on your back.
Pretty much. And there were not many safe areas to operate in China, because the most you had were maybe universities or Shanghai. And even then, you were still pretty much marked, because you still had like a bunch of quasi-anarchist uprisings, especially with labor struggles after Liu Shifu's death, and other anarchists started moving in to try and start organizing labor unions. But a lot of them around this time during the warlord period would either be suppressed violently or be kind of forced underground until the big shining moment of the May 4th movement.
What is the May 4th movement?
The May 4th movement, if you're looking at it from the communist lens, it is when the people of China rose up against the Western imperialists, against basically the winning powers of World War I, because this does have its results in Japan being given all the German concessions and China basically getting nothing, despite at the time contributing to the labor pool.
Now, I wanted to ask about that, because it seems like on the surface, World War I would be a good time for China to catch up to the Western powers technologically and economically, because the Western powers are all fighting each other. A perfect time for China to peacefully develop, but they've got all this chaos going on and they can't even take advantage of that.
And the most they were able to get for a head start from their industrialization, for the most part, was either in the European concessions or the armaments industry.
And then the Japanese get all the German concessions.
Yeah. Japan's given the German concessions, and it just basically means that China, even though contributing, even as fragmented as they were to the labor pool for the European powers, China really got nothing in the end of it. And you have all these years of buildup in the background of Japan, because even after the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan was slowly moving in for economic interests. And not to mention, at the same time, also in the background, contributing to some of the warlord politics, you have this huge buildup of everything going wrong for China for decades at this point. And the May 4th movement was just the final fuse that just led to a lot of people just having enough, at least in the educated circles, because it was largely the educated circles that seemed to rise up.
Okay, so this would then be, what, 1919?
Yep, this is 1919. Because in the wake of it, you had a bunch of people starting to become politically active, especially in the anarchist circles, because beforehand, before the First World War, you still had your minor groups who sometimes gave lectures, did some education, even did some mutual aid in the villages, because there were other social movements at the time, because a lot of these anarchists were concerned, like at least doing social revolution on the local level. And the May 4th movement was probably the biggest terms of social revolution that they've had as a somewhat unified group. Because I know the communists try and at least hijack it for their own means, which is, fair enough. A lot of these guys also got their start in the wake of the May the 4th movement, because even then the Chinese Communist Party wasn't founded until 2 years after that happened.
Okay, so the CCP is founded then in 1921.
Yeah, under Chen Duziu, not Mao.
I was about to say, I don't think Mao was the leader then, right?
Yeah, we have to add the important caveat that Mao did not form the Chinese Communist Party. That was Chen Duziu and a few other guys. And Chen Duziu, I only remember his name because he was the Trotskyist. Oof. Yeah. Don't be a Trotskyist in the communist world, kids.
Good way to get ice picked.
In a freak mountain climbing accident.
So, thank you for that.
I had to do that.
This is peak radio here. Webby Award stuff, folks. I got you covered. So the Chinese Civil War has, well, I keep saying it breaks out. It's been going on. It just keeps changing form. So 1921, the Chinese Communist Party is formed. And at this point, can you remind me of the name of the new guy who has declared himself emperor? Because I'm terrible at Chinese names. Yuan Shikai.
He eventually abdicates within a year, and it just explodes from there. It goes back to sort of provisional government, but it's just anything goes.
So he abdicates. A provisional government is nominally in charge, but in reality, none of the warlords are listening.
Yeah, pretty much. If you want to have any semblance of power of the Republic of China at the time, the first attempt, still, I would say, you basically had to be in charge of Beijing, where the seat of power was. But the problem is that these warlords would often fight against each other in major cliques, because you had the main fight between largely 3 different warlord groups at the time, because you had the Anhui, the Jili, and the I'm trying to remember the name of the one that's in Manchuria. I think it's the Fengtian. Fengtian? All I know is it's led by Zhang Zuolin. I'll just say the warlord Manchuria under Zhang Zuolin until I can remember his name, the name of the actual clique. I think it's Fengtian. You had largely a big fight between the 3, because those were largely the main 3, with occasional warlords backstabbing each other. And then you had other warlords in the peripheries, especially with Sun Yat-sen's reforming Kuomintang at the time. And these anarchists were working in tandem with Sun Yat-sen, and they almost got their faces obliterated off the face of the earth, because the southern warlords, as fragmented as they were, if you had a warlord who was good, they were good, but they weren't strong enough.
Okay, great. Some great strategic leadership, but not the best army to fight with.
Too fragmented.
Now, by the time the Japanese invade Manchu Kuo, has the Kuomintang consolidated most of the country, or are they still split up like that? Because I'm thinking of Manchuria being its own separate group of warlords. I'm thinking, well, if the Japanese come in and those guys are still feuding with everybody else, maybe they just get hung out to dry.
Well, the Kuomintang did eventually consolidate, but they had to get some help from our good dear old friends, the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union in 24 and 25, with the initial training of a new army. And as a part of that, a bunch of officers within the Kuomintang armed forces, including Jiang Jieshi, Chiang Kai-shek, would be sent to the Soviet Union to at least get some training. And along with these reforms and political training, the Kuomintang eventually became the dominant force of the South, and eventually started consolidating slowly until Sun Yat-sen's death in 24-25. And then Jiang Jieshi, he decided to he basically became in charge at that point, because he was in charge in the military, but he still had to play ball with the remaining Paris anarchists within his court, because they were founding party members. So
Coalition politics.
Yeah, coalition politics. And this also had to result in the United Front, which was also another sort of condition that you had with the aid of Soviets, because Soviets provided initial armament, commissar training. Strangely enough, early modern Chinese military history can trace itself to at least having some Soviet elements like commissars, because you got to have your soldiers politically educated.
Now, this is all fascinating to me. I had read before about Chiang Kai-shek being trained by the Soviets. I was not aware of that they had much more widespread backing for the early Kuomintang. Why are they backing the Kuomintang? Is it just the Soviets choosing a faction to back to take some sort of control?
Well, I'm trying to remember the politics at the time, but I do know at some point the Soviets did try and initiate some type of communist revolution in China, but even then the Chinese leftist groups at the time were a little bit still, very fragmented. The Chinese Communist Party was still in its infancy, and they did have people who were inserted into there, but it was just a very convoluted sense of politics, and Sun Yat-sen at the time was at least nominally a socialist, and he seemed to be contending to at least be somewhat the dominant group at the time, since he was able to sort of stabilize his position in the South after nearly being obliterated. Plus, not to mention, he still had at least some semblance of developmental leftism in China at the point, so you had to at least say something, I guess. But even then, the politics of why is very, very murky, because I wish I could say what it is, but I do know part of it had to do with Comintern politics at the time.
All right. Now, you did mention them putting commissars in. Did they start trying to soft purge the anarchists at this point? Do they still need the anarchists?
Sort of, but also no. Chiang Kai-shek, again, was a micromanager. He still did at least do some level of curbing. It wasn't exactly purging. I guess curbing is the better word for it, because he did try to at least have some loyal divisions to him, but there were also some other divisions that were being slowly but surely infiltrated by the Soviets, and I wouldn't be surprised if anarchists still played a role. But the anarchists, after the Bolshevik Revolution, were slowly but surely losing their power, as the Soviets were able to at least send more material funding and aid to more dominant groups, like the Kuomintang at the time, which was slowly but surely stabilizing and expanding. But Chiang Kai-shek, by the time 1926 rolled around, he had to maintain the wildest coalition of the remaining Paris anarchists that were still in the old guard, newly arriving communists, and also trying to maintain his own loyalty. So it gets very wild.
So he's, like you said, he's never really in control of the mainland. He's constantly balancing various factions within his own movement then.
Yeah. And the only time he's able to at least get a head start on purging to consolidate his power was during the final push towards Beijing and the Northern Expedition from 1926 to 27, which was the final attempt at the Kuomintang actually making it to Beijing. And during that march to the north, this was when Chiang Kai-shek managed to finally start his purging. I mean, he still had to he purged the communists and some of the newer anarchists, but he still had to throw the anarchists a bone. And this was probably the final heyday of the anarchists in power, at least in China. Because even all the while, they were still maybe attempting to organize on the local level, at least attempting some type of thing. They were slowly but surely being purged more and more, except at the top level, but this was also their final hurrah in the world of education, of all places.
Really? That's where he puts his last anarchist friends, as in charge of education?
Pretty much, because there's this, largely under the direction of a supposed not anarchist, but definitely anarchist Tsai Ing-wen. because he attempted like major education reform on anarchist lines where he tried to divide everywhere into at least somewhat independent zones where he was, like more providing the general guidelines at the top level, but each independent zone could do their own thing tailored to what they need, and they tried to infuse work with education. And their main magnum opus with that was in 1927 in Shanghai, after the dust settled, when Chiang Kai-shek pulled a gamer move and purged the communists to the point where the Japanese were spooked. And yeah, needless to say, the Japanese were also making encroachments during that too. But needless to say, 1927 was the last hurrah of the anarchists, where they set up the Laodong Datsue, the labor university based on the Belgian vocational school model.
And that's in Shanghai?
Yep.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So then, is that school still in existence, do you know?
No, Chiang Kai-shek forcibly shut it down after the Japanese border skirmish in 1931 as part of the Manchukuo annexation. Because the labor university was... It reads exactly like Maoist education. I don't know how to put it. Like, a lot of... the Kuomintang attempted it. It was more of a pet project at that point to at least throw the anarchists a bone. But you had a vocational school that basically had students working, also learning, granted more specified fields, but it was a vocational school that infused what somewhat a consistent thought that the anarchists had, which was infuse work with education, which was you learn how the world works, literature, philosophy, whatnot, but also learn how to do practical skills. Like, they had a general sort of idea what they wanted. They had some, like minor differences about what they wanted with that, but there was that general overall view of infusing work with education that eventually the Maoists adopted.
Okay, so does Chiang Kai-shek then close the school down because it's too uncomfortably close to being Maoist?
Nah, it was just kind of like him trying to consolidate because he finally got rid of the communists, which means he can go after the anarchists next. Because even then, there was always a crackdown of anarchists in China throughout the anarchist history there. But there would be some, at least, I think the only time that the anarchists enjoyed some breathing room was in that limited period after 1919 to about 1925 before Sun Yat-sen died. Because you had an explosion of like Chinese students getting introduced to it and starting their own newspapers and putting at least some of their ideas to work on the local level. But the main problem with anarchism in general is if you're in a state and you're separated from other anarchists and other people and you can't communicate, you're not really going to move very far. It just seems that the logistics for them was very much against them. And needless to say, if you were an anarchist, you were educated in China, and China didn't have the most educated populace at the time. Like, everything was working against them. And the only people who eventually got it right was Mao, where Mao took a lot of lessons learned because he was very much, I wouldn't say he was an anarchist, but he was some type of socialist from the moment he was radicalized.
Well, yeah, he obviously had some significant differences with the Bolsheviks. Was willing to accept their help, but
yeah, because Mao himself, he understood the lay of the land very well. I'd say he had more of an understanding of the lay of the land compared to the other Marxists of the time, which were still fairly intellectual and weren't really on boots on ground like Mao was.
Well, yeah, S-tier general.
Yeah, if you want to have something that works, you have to understand the situation. And the thing was, the anarchists did try, but the problem was, again, they were a little bit too intellectual, I guess is the best way to put it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. You can lead a movement from a university, but you can't fight a war from one.
Pretty much, especially if you're actively being hunted from every angle. Yeah, and everyone's starving.
So the anarchists are then removed from Chiang's movement. It sounds like some of them, do some of them end up working with the Maoists? Or
Yeah.
are they...
A good chunk of them, if I would definitely say, yeah, a good chunk definitely did end up flying over to Mao to varying degrees. Sometimes because sometimes anarchists just become communists. That's just how it is. And I wouldn't put it the same way with a lot of anarchists who were educated at the time, because a lot of Maoism does have a good amount of overlap with communism, especially if you read Kropotkin. There's at least a semblance of mutual aid. The Maoists at the times were inserting themselves into local life, committing to mutual aid, helping people out, giving them education to a degree. I mean, the only difference is that you have to give up on the idea of stateless, hierarchicalist society, but with a little bit of bureaucracy added in. But the Maoists certainly did make an attempt, and they seemed to win out in the end for a multitude of reasons, mostly because the Bolsheviks went too hard for their thing and nearly got themselves annihilated.
Okay, and Mao's kind of pursuing his rural strategy and is able to avoid getting defeated in any major battles.
Well, Mao was a very interesting guy of himself where nobody trusted him. Because Mao definitely did believe in the coalition strategy, too, which led to a lot of communists in the camp not trusting him for that, not to mention he was just habitually not a good worker. So
to clarify, a lot of them didn't want to work with him because he was insufficiently communist, because he was willing to engage in coalition politics.
Pretty much, he was viewed as too moderate at times because he worked with the Kuomintang in the First United Front. At other times, he was just not really there when he should have been. Because if I remember, he was always a late riser, but he did write a lot. He was a very prolific writer to the end, through and through. But he did blend a lot of things in together, because he did believe in Marxism, Leninism. That's without a doubt. He did believe in that, but he also did believe in coalitions too. Because how the heck do you get a bunch of anarchists to your side and a bunch of people to your side that you wouldn't expect? But the anarchists, on the other hand, they were just so busy self-imploding. I don't think they wouldn't even be able to get a grip, with some few exceptions. I know one anarchist who eventually somewhat sided with Mao was Bajin. Bajin was prolifically more of a writer than anything. He wrote a bunch of novels. Most famous one is Family. If you're ever getting into Bajin, Family's probably the first book you're probably going to hear from him, because in all honesty, it's kind of like, because his politics comes out through his fiction.
Okay. Well, it was really kind of like Victor Hugo in that regard. I think Victor Hugo's overtly political writings amount to a handful of essays, and but you can tell his politics when you read his novels.
Yeah, it's kind of like with Tolstoy too, and Tolstoy was an anarchist. And needless to say, the Chinese anarchists also like that guy.
So, returning, I guess, to we've come to the point, I guess, where Mao's kind of taking control. He's willing to work with the anarchists, at least some of them, those who haven't self-imploded.
Pretty much, because some anarchists, especially amongst the Liu Shifu group, they did have a lot of overlap with Maoism. Because I'm trying to figure out how to describe how much overlap there is, because Liu Shifu was a fierce follower of Kropotkin. And Kropotkin, in the end, if you know your Russian Civil War history, he sides with the Bolsheviks. So needless to say, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of Liu Shifu's following, I mean, even though some of them were definitely fierce to the end, siding with him, there would be people who would eventually side with the Maoists. It's hard to get like a whole general consensus, because a lot of this isn't very well written down. I mean, a lot of anarchists did write themselves. Like, there were a lot of newspapers and journals at the time, but the problem is like, a lot of it just got suppressed or lost to time. I mean, there are some people who managed to save the works, but it's just hard to get a consensus. because a lot of anarchists in China, they were just self-imploding left and right. Whether it be with the Tokyo group self-imploding because the mix of Japan pushing them out and Liu Shipei basically going turncoat and siding with the monarchs, with a monarchy in the end. Or you have the Paris group that went with the Guomindang, or Liu Shifu's group, which is now having to come with a crossroads of what the fuck do we do?
So basically, the anarchists are completely split.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, you end up with the communists becoming united.
Yeah, especially after the Long March, because the Long March was the thing that definitely solidified Mao's power. Because before the Long March, Mao was attached with all the other, like, stronger-backed party members of the old guard in the South fighting against Chiang Kai-shek in the annihilation campaigns, of which, if I remember, I think it was either number 4 or number 5, but I know it was in 1933, the annihilation campaign of 33-34 was when Mao was forced to go on the Long March, which forced out all the leadership that could have stood against Mao, pretty much were forced out, especially as each part of the march where the communists had to run, they just looked even worse as time went on. And by the time Mao even reached Yan'an, he was pretty much the only guy left who was pretty much capable of being somewhat of a military leader and leading his force to, at least, despite losing almost the entirety of it, to Yan'an.
Okay, and what the other major leaders just lose credibility or quit?
Pretty much, because I'm trying to remember which battle it was, but I know the Chinese made a propaganda movie about it. That's so bad, but I just watched it just have a good laugh and be like, look at our god Mao. Because that's what it was. I mean, I love me a good propaganda movie if it can make me laugh.
I'm still waiting for the Blumhouse parody movie where, like, George Washington WWE body slams King George III or something.
Yeah. But I wish I could see that too. But I just know, at least with Mao, by the end of the Long March, a lot of the leadership that basically, they basically had to run out of their base. They basically lost a critical battle. And this was around the same time when the Germans were training the Chinese army at the time.
Okay, so the Germans are training the Guomindang at this point?
Yeah, because after Sun Yat-sen pulled a gamer move and pushed the communists out of the United Front, he was kind of leaderless for at least who to come in to fill the void, because he eventually pushed the Soviets out, and he brought in the Germans in roughly about 31. And it didn't become an official deal until 34. So you have Chiang Kai-shek pushing out the communists and pushing in the Germans. So now you have Chiang Kai-shek trying to solidify. He's also wrangling in the warlords at the time. And he probably had his most arguably powerful period from 1928 to 1931, because the Japanese, pretty much after the Northern Expedition failed, they straight up assassinated Zhang Zuolin, and his son Zhang Zuiliang came into power in Manchuria for at least a brief period of like 2-3 years.
So now one of your rival factions has just had a shake-up in leadership. The new leader doesn't have as much credibility. Chiang is the default big man in China for the time being.
Well, it was not necessarily. It was because Zhang Zuiliang pretty much saw the writing on the wall that, like, yeah, the Japanese are encroaching on us. I think it might be better to side with Chiang Kai-shek at the time. And even then, throughout this entire time, the only warlords that stayed by Chiang's side were the Ma.
Okay.
The Muslim warlords.
And they were always with Chiang?
Well, they weren't always with Chiang. They more sided with him as time went on, because if you got the loyalty of the Ma, they would stay with you to the end.
I did not know that.
Yeah. I tried reading into, like, a lot of the Ma warlords. They're an interesting bunch. But needless to say, those guys were loyal to the end to the Guomindang, and I don't think they get enough credit for it. But I do know all the while the anarchists were still basically losing their power in China at this time, because once you got rid of the communists, you pretty much are having free reign. And the last hurrah of the anarchists was with the education field, and even then that was quashed by 32. So you basically just have all these old guard anarchists who are still there, and the only anarchists who still have any credibility left is pretty much Ba Jin at this point. You're basically either forced underground, forced to side with the Maoists, or circling back to the Northern Expedition, you pull the ultimate betrayal and side with Japan.
I could see that making it hard for anarchists to regain any political foothold in certain areas.
Yeah, because I also have to bring up another name that also goes back, Wang Jingwei. Because this guy worked with Sun Yat-sen for a long time, pretty much from just about the inception of Sun Yat-sen's first attempt at a unified China under the Dongmenhui, but he worked very closely with anarchists. So Wang Jingwei was kind of like an anarchist leader in a sense. I wish I could know more about his politics, but it's so hard to find anything because, how do I put it? It's understandable why no one wants to remember his name. Because after the Northern Expedition, because when he was doing his part of the Northern Expedition, because he went to Wuhan and he tried to set up something there. And Chiang Kai-shek, after he was done purging the communists in Shanghai, he started moving his eyes towards Wuhan because Wang Jingwei was in Wuhan with a bunch of other leftist anarchists and all that kind of stuff. And he had to run. So he ended up going to Japan. And when Sino-Japanese War II, the bad one, Japan starts moving its way down from the north, in from the center, and a little bit from the south. Not so much south, more from the center. And the center part of the country, especially around the then Kuomintang capital of Nanjing, he eventually puts Wang Jingwei in charge of one of the provisional governments in central China. So that is arguably the worst fate of an anarchist you can get.
To be put in charge of a government?
A Japanese puppet government nonetheless. You basically committed the ultimate sin, the ultimate betrayal. Because if you know anything like I do about Japan and the Second Sino-Japanese War, there is something that you shouldn't do on a fundamental mistake, and that is siding with Japan. And needless to say, Wang Jingwei, along with some other warlords who were pushed out during the Northern Expedition, sided with Japan. So you now have an awkward four-way split. And what happened with anarchists in China, you either were a Paris group anarchist who sided with the Kuomintang or split or participated in the split that led to Liu Shifu. You were part of the Tokyo anarchists who either self-imploded or sided with Yuan Shikai and just basically self-implode from there. Liu Shifu's group has to basically contend with either sticking true to who they are or going with the Maoists or the Kuomintang. And then you have the people who stuck with the Kuomintang and the Paris group who eventually got purged themselves or became untouchable because you were part of the old guard and you don't touch the founders of a country.
So to any of those, fast forwarding then, through the Sino-Japanese, Second Sino-Japanese War and the Civil War, because the anarchists seem to be less and less militarily relevant at this point. Do any of them stick around when Mao finally takes control of China? Are there any old guard anarchists still in his inner circle somewhere?
Not really. They're more on the peripheries where it's like a guy knows a guy. And that's basically Ba Jin. Ba Jin's probably the most successful anarchist in Chinese history by virtue of how he managed to stay. Because in the post-Civil War, if there were even any anarchists left in China, you either had to go underground or leave. And one of the ways that a lot of anarchists who even stayed alive after, like Chiang Kai-shek was losing, they went to Taiwan, or they ended up going somewhere else entirely. Where could have been anywhere, to be honest, because I know some of them ended up in the United States to begin with. The only one that I know that's famous that stayed was Ba Jin. And Ba Jin was a character in of himself.
Now, did he get caught up in the Cultural Revolution?
Yeah, he got caught up in so many revolutions. That man was nothing but the revolution his entire life. Because he was born in 1904, before the Qing dynasty collapsed. Was basically a kid during the early provisional government, and pretty much to Yuan Shikai declaring himself emperor and abdicating, and teenager throughout the first phase of the Civil War when it was warlords instead of communists versus nationalists. He started his writing, even met Emma Goldman and Berkman.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, he legit met Emma Goldman and Berkman because after Emma Goldman and Berkman were kicked out of the Soviet Union, their first stop was basically China. And Ba Jin got to meet Berkman and Goldman. And he basically continued on his, his anarchist work after that throughout the Civil War, largely in Shanghai, because this man was pretty much just a writer. That's pretty much all he did. And he wrote a lot of novels. I kind of think of him sort of like a Tolstoy figure in a sense, where Tolstoy didn't really contribute much militarily, but when it came to writing, he did a lot. And a lot of people, followed in his footsteps. And Ba Jin's overall core themes were he largely stopped doing his stuff after the Great Leap Forward because, how do I put it? Man was getting depressed because reading through Family, you start seeing this theme of the hopeful beginning, but by the end, it's just like, what am I even fighting for? I know what I want, but I don't know what I'm fighting for anymore. Like, that's the general gist of a lot of, like, the two books I was able to read, Family and Ward 4, that's pretty much what it feels like the entire time.
I can see that. I mean, I imagine living through that period as an anarchist, and the 1910s and early 20s would be such a hopeful time, and then by the Second Sino-Japanese War, it's basically all over.
Yeah, somehow he managed to survive that war, and he managed to live basically throughout the entirety of Mao, and into all the other subsequent successors, even lived through Tiananmen Square, because the Chinese government at the time was always keeping tabs on him, because he decided to stay in the mainland, and he still did to his dying day. He died in 2005. Like, to put this in perspective, Henry Kissinger, he lived to 100 years and a month. Ba Jin, he lived through every single major historical event, contributed to every historical event, still came out the other side, but managed to live to the ripe old age of 100 years and 11 months.
Nice.
Yeah, he lived a long time. And I remember, I don't know if it's still up on Amazon. I know one of his last books he wrote, I can't remember when it was released, but I know the Amazon cover is Tank Man. Like, Ba Jin lived to an old age, lived through arguably the worst time to be alive, lived through it all, saw it all, contributed to it all, and yet still managed to live to a very, very old age.
Yeah, I mean, geez, when he was born, a telephone was a luxury item, and he was probably saw some of the very first memes.
I wouldn't be surprised if he did, because I knew if he knew that Tank Man existed, mostly to the degree that they had to keep a very close eye on him after the crackdown. I wouldn't be surprised if he knew some memes himself.
Well, this seems like a good point to transition. And I'm just going to ask an open-ended question because I know nothing about Daoism. What is Daoism, and how, if at all, does it relate to anarchy? Or anarchism, not anarchy.
Daoism is I'd say, one of the original forms of anarcho-pacifism in a weird way, because Daoism was... The history of it's pretty weird, because you have this... Allegedly, this guy who basically rage quit from society, but the thing is, it's just like, it's not really known who really invented it, because it was around the same time that Buddhism cropped up, and it's kind of a question of who came first, Buddhism or Daoism, because there isn't really a concrete founder for it. But the general gist of it, if you read just the Tao Te Ching, there's this element of effortless action, non-action, where you're just basically living with the Tao, and the Tao is just basically thing, that function, life force, everything and nothing at the same time, is the best way I can put it into simple words. Everything and nothing. It exists. It doesn't exist. If there is a thing, there has to be another thing, regardless. And there's very rarely a time where they talk about government in the Tao Te Ching. The most you get with government is sage kings. And if there is a state, it's just basically very small. And the kings are just basically sages. They don't do much. Everyone lives a very primitive life, farming and existing, because the Tao just does a thing. And then you get further solidification with the Zhuangzi, with Master Zhuang, which that guy was definitely real. And because that man was more of an individual kind of thing, looking more towards the individual, just basically roasting people for just basically bothering him when he just wants to do his own thing.
Sounds like Diogenes.
Yeah, Zhuang was basically Diogenes in China. Because my favorite story from him is he had a day off. He's fishing. And Master Zhuang was a government official. And a couple government officials were sent out to get him because they needed some help. And he's just like, there was this ceremonial turtle that was kept in a box. He was pampered, well cared for, but he was in that box. Now, there's also a pig at the same time. He gets to do whatever he wants. He gets to roll around in the mud. Who would you rather be? Would you rather be the turtle in the box or the pig rolling around in the mud? And the officials are like, I think I'd rather be the pig in the mud. And he's like, now let me keep fishing. I'm paraphrasing this. But that's basically the general gist of the story.
Definitely the Chinese Diogenes.
And then you have the third group of Taoists, when they actually got to try overall for a government with the Taoist project under the Han Dynasty. King Liu An, one of the feudal lords of the Han Dynasty, he gets together a court of Taoists. And eventually, as time goes on, and the Huainanzi is a very long read. My translation, which to my knowledge is the only translation, it's a college textbook basically, it's over 1,000 pages long, and it reiterates a lot of the same stuff. But the problem is it's just a long book, and it still does get to try and attempt that premise of getting as close to the king being a sage, and that's it. But eventually the Han Dynasty said, nah, not anymore, and eventually they just took over the Liu An's kingdom, which was known as Huainan, which is why it's called the Huainanzi. So basically...
So there was actually a legit Taoist one, obviously more than one. You had your early sage kings, but there was like a legit Taoist state.
Or at least an attempt at it. But that was like thousands and thousands of years ago, like around the time of the, trying to remember, the Han Dynasty. I think this was around the time when there were Roman emperors.
Okay,
So to put that into perspective.
Still a very long time ago.
Yeah, it was a very long time ago. But you still had an attempt, at least somewhat, at least in the scholarly circles. And the reason why I find it more in the anarchist camp is because even though there's definitely some semblance of a state, it's pretty much redundant. It's just there on paper, not doing a thing. You're just basically functioning as an advisor at most.
Yeah, it seems like about the most laid-back kind of state you could have.
Yeah. It's not as wacky as like some of the religious anarchist groups that came up later on around. I'm trying to figure out like when a good time period of that would be. I mean, I wouldn't say after Enlightenment. I mean, you still had some. I'd still put the religious anarchism camp more between the Quakers and Tolstoy more than anything.
I think the Quakers are definitely candidates.
Yeah, Quakers are definitely candidates for being anarchists. I do have quite a number of Quaker literature, and strangely enough, Mennonites could sometimes qualify in that camp. I still gotta read up more on that.
When I was a teenager, my family used to go to this camp every year, and it was run by Mennonites. It had nothing to do with being Mennonites. It was just a nature camp, and it was presumably how they raised money to do their Mennonite stuff. But they seemed like very laid back, countrified folks.
And they go places. They certainly go places. Certainly to the middle of nowhere, Khanate of Khiva, Central Asia.
So this amused me. Can you just tell the audience about the Kievan Mennonites? Because this was a fascinating anecdote to me.
Yeah, I found out about this through Russian government reports. But apparently, when the Mennonites were going on their long trek all around the world to find new places to live, one group settled up in the Khanate of Khiva, primarily. If I remember right, I think one of the reasons was they made really good glass. And they somehow ended up in the middle of Central Asia. Like a group of them ended up in the middle of Central Asia and managed to live there for decades in the Central Asian steppe under a Khan. Just minding their own business with royal protection. Because apparently one of the leaders of the group made an impression of the Khan at the time, to the point, and if I remember, I think one of the reasons why I think the Russians said they got protection was they made good glass. And I know that the last major one of the only major governor generals, a Russian officer by the name of Koshkin, devoted 5 pages of his initial opening report to the court of the Khan, was like, there are Mennonites out here, and they're asking if we can provide them a teacher because they're looking for a teacher that can speak German.
That is wild. The things you learn when you're reading history. So, Jordyn, you're starting your own podcast.
Yes.
Do you have a name picked out that you would like to tell people, a social channel you'd like to shout out?
Well, right now, I'm, for the most part, still perpetually working on episode 1 of the Possum Mallstorian podcast, where I largely focus on shopping malls and elements of retail history. Fairlane Village Mall, number 1.
So, dead malls.
Yes.
This is probably the thing you talk about most, and I find it fascinating. What do you find fascinating about dead malls? And by the way, everybody, I am aware that we are completely changing subjects here, but yeah, what about dead malls? What do you find fascinating?
For the most part, I got started out of a mix of spite and fascination with Dan Bell, because my first Dead Mall video was someone said they made a video. Dan Bell made a video on Coventry Mall, and I got, at the same time I was mad because it's just like he just hated on it just because of how it looked, and it's just like, bro, you got the most chaotic mall in Pennsylvania. I mean, granted, he didn't know at the time, but it would eventually become the most chaotic mall in Pennsylvania. And then his video on Forest Fair Mall out in Cincinnati, Ohio, formerly known as Cincinnati Mills, which is now being demolished. And it's just like, there's this look of, like seeing nothing. Because, how do I put it? In death, there is life. Where that life is, it could have been in the past, it could be now. And there's just sometimes these weirdest stories that come together of how these malls were made, such as like what I'm working with episode 1 with Fairlane Village, because that mall was the brainchild of car dealership brothers William and Robert Seitzinger.
A pair of car dealership owning brothers opened a mall
On top of a coal vein and had to fight the Department of Transportation.
So tell me a little bit. Well, maybe you don't want to spoil your first episode.
No, I don't mind talking about it.
So tell me about this coal vein. They presumably buy this land. They're going to build a mall, and they find what, anthracite?
I'm trying to remember the type of coal, but apparently it was known that it was at one point a coal mine, and they bought the mall, and they had to basically dig out and fill in the coal mine on top of having to level out the terrain because it was just nothing but hills there where it is. I mean, it's still a hill, but it's a leveled out hill now. But they basically were trying to build the mall after they got inspiration from the Whitehall Mall in Allentown, which is by some sheer miracle still there. So this is the 60s we're talking about. And so when they're trying to build this mall, PennDOT refuses to give them an egress for an entrance and eventually says, hey, we're looking at routing Route 61 through the land you bought, so we want to buy your land through eminent domain. And they had to fight years for that. It wasn't until 1972 when they got all the legal work started out, because they started doing work after they bought the land in 66, finally got it all settled in 72, didn't get started on fully constructing the mall until 1974, and all the while they keep on saying, like roughly every 2 years, there's going to be a mall here, there's going to be a mall here. And even then, they couldn't open it all at once. They had to open it in phases. And even then, I still can't figure out how it went, other than August 13th, 1974, Al Boskov shows up for the grand opening of Boskov's number 5.
Did that Boskov's serve the famous Boskov melt?
Yes, I miss the Boskov's patty melt so dear. My beloved.
Well, thanks so much for coming today, Jordyn. Say the name of your upcoming podcast again.
Possum Mallstorian.
Possum Mallstorian. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Jordyn. Appreciate having you.
No problem, Dan.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you listening and or watching. And tune in approximately 6 weeks or thereabouts for the beginning of Season 2.
Ooh, Season 2.
Bye.
Bye.